Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Annie Kuhl.
I'm Rath Wang. As China expands its military, today we look at Xi Jinping's efforts to block U.S. allied support to Taiwan in the case of or when it invades, starting from the first Pacific island chain to the third.
Joining us to discuss today is Huang Kui-bo, Associate Professor of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University. Professor Huang is a renowned expert in international relations. And Brian Hu, founding editor of New Blue magazine. Brian is a frequent commentator on international media on Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific, China, and the U.S. A warm welcome back to both of you on the show today.
We also hear later from military experts Cleo Pascal, Indo-Pacific Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She is an expert in China, India, Pacific Island security, and Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, based in Washington, where President Tsai Ing-wen will be speaking during her U.S. transit. The latest Taiwan Defense Ministry report says China is expanding combat capabilities in the second island chain. Let's take a look at what exactly are the Pacific Island chains. As you can see here, the first island chain runs from Japan to Malaysia. Taiwan lies right in the heart of it. The second island chain passes through the Japanese archipelago with Guam and other U.S. Pacific territories, while the third island chain begins in Alaska and runs through Hawaii all the way to Australia and New Zealand, key U.S. allies. Professor, the Chinese Navy is conducting drills in the Western Pacific. Given that it's making advances into the second island chain, how concerning is this?
I think for the U.S. and its Western Pacific allies, the expansion of the PLA capability beyond the first island chain would be threatening, not only because of some military reasons, but also because of the political reasons. Let's talk about the military reasons first. In the past, the concept of the island chain was coined by John Dulles, the former U.S. Secretary of State.
And the name of the airport in Washington.
Right. In the early 1950s. So he referred to these islands as chains in order to contain the expansion of the communist regimes during the Cold War. So militarily, these island chains are of great importance for deter any potential attacks from the communist governments and military. And also, the U.S. has been able to take advantage of these island chains to enhance its so-called cooperative security with its Pacific allies, so that the U.S. doesn't have to spend all the budget related to the defense, but having this budget sharing with its allies. And all these U.S. allies can join with the U.S. to defend part of the Western Pacific. And also militarily, the U.S. could take advantage of the different locations of those countries in different island chains to equip them with different weaponry systems, like Japan.
Right.
Japan has been receiving the top quality of U.S. weaponry systems from the U.S.
You mean like F-22s and all these other?
Right, the most advanced.
But do you think with this first, second, and third island chain, all these U.S. and ally strategy, is it enough to contain China?
So that's a military strategy to contain communist China or Russia. But I also would like to mention the political factor in relation to the island chain concept. The U.S. used the island chain concept to form some sort of different coalitions with these Pacific countries. And so some countries included in the island chain would be seen as a partner of the U.S., and the U.S. would use this as a way to encourage them to continue further cooperation with the U.S. in order to contain the expansion of the communist regimes. So by Dulles, this island chain concept is both military and political. I think it applies to what we're seeing nowadays. The U.S. is trying to maintain its first island chain capability in order to contain mainland China. But later, maybe we're going to discuss the U.S. is also enhancing its second island chain defense capability because the U.S. feels the need.
If we go back to the first island chain for a little bit, Brian, I would like to ask you, since Professor also talked about the importance of all these countries, including we're seeing Japan and South Korea, and recently they're also increasing their military budget. So being the neighboring countries to Taiwan, do you think they're also very threatened?
So I think it's a regional development. I mean, these aggressions from China directed not only at Taiwan, but also Japan, the Philippines, and so forth. The South China Seas is, of course, a major factor here. But then the concern from the US is that China has blue water ambitions to expand power by maritime means. And so we have this island chain concept from the Cold War, but in this globalized age, we also have to think about is the economic factor, in that China is a very large economy and Asia-Pacific countries often do trade with China. And so particularly I think this is why the US has made moves to cement the Asia-Pacific economically in the past decades with the TPP, which did not really work out once Trump withdrew from that. But now particularly regarding strengthening these long-standing military relationships. And so we've seen some results which also do seem to be the product of increased concern not only from these countries but from the US, such as, for example, South Korea and Japan putting to rest long-standing enmities and signing a security agreement, or moving towards that rather.
How successful do you feel, Professor? As Brian mentioned, the economic aspect from the PRC is huge.
Right.
But we see the Solomon Islands having some difficulties with China, and we've seen the Marshall Islands talk about perhaps re-establishing ties with Taiwan. Do you feel the U.S. is making inroads?
The U.S. has been playing a major role in determining or in influencing the diplomatic situations in the South Pacific or in the island chain countries, especially those island countries. I have to say that, yes, the U.S. has been influential, but as Rath just mentioned, the economic influence of mainland China increased as well.
Right.
So the economic statecraft and diplomacy conducted by the PRC government, I think, have been more effective in some places, like in the Southern Pacific countries, where the Republic of China, Taiwan, used to enjoy a great deal of advantage. So I think the U.S. has recognized this fact that it needs to boost some economic measures in order to attract greater support from these island countries in South Pacific, while Taiwan, maintaining a couple of diplomatic ties there could make the same effort to help U.S. stabilize diplomatic situation in the second island chain.
Do you feel the U.S. could still catch up, or do you
The
feel
U.S. is catching up, or is trying to maintain its past advantage over the PRC? But sometimes the situations are tricky, like the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands reportedly tried to collaborate with the Beijing authorities to set up some military bases, and the U.S. actually technically intervened. And the U.S. even said that the U.S. shows great concern about the possibility of establishing military bases by the support of the PRC. And now we haven't seen any further information about these military bases. And the Solomon Island government said this cooperation between Solomon Islands and the PRC is aimed at Solomon Islands' domestic safety and security, not aimed at external partners. So I think if there is an attempt by Beijing authorities to set up military bases in the Solomon Island countries, I think the attempt of Beijing has failed. The PNG has been able to enhance its cooperation with the U.S. to deal with the increasing military influence of the People's Liberation Army in the South Pacific. And I think the U.S. has now been looking back to the South Pacific and knowing, okay, if I'm not paying more attention to this area, this region, then the PRC is coming in.
Probably just going to take over like that. So do you think this is also at the same time building a lot of pressure to the U.S. right now at this point, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is one of the reasons why the US has taken much more interest when diplomatic allies of Taiwan are pried off through legislation such as the Taipei Act. Because it's not only the matter of Taiwan's international space, but also the geostrategic positioning of some of these allies for maritime shipping, for safety in terms of the island chains, and so forth. The Solomon Islands is an interesting example, though, particularly regarding that. There was this kind of move towards a security agreement with China, concern about stronger ties not only from the US, but also Australia and other powers in the region then resulted from that. But there's also kind of a split politics there in the Solomon Island, in which the opposition from Malaita, one of the islands there, is more pro-Taiwan, stronger business ties with Taiwan, but also this cautiousness of China. And so it is actually quite interesting that with regards to these smaller islands caught between the US and China in this sense, a similar split to that which exists in Taiwan, let's say politically, has also opened up regarding which choice forward for which side you want to lean on. Because a lot of these, I think, island nations, if they did have strong military ties with the US, for example, they'd be very cautious of, let's say, a preemptive attack from China to prevent action regarding a Taiwan contingency.
Professor, some analysts say that the US Indo-Pacific strategy is shifting from the first island chain to the second. Do you feel this is because it sees more of an immediate need to strengthen the second island chain, or do you feel it's leaving the first island chain?
Depending on how you look at this issue, maybe Rath is correct in saying that the US feels the need to enhance the second island chain defense capability. But if you look at it from a different angle, then like I myself would say, the US is enhancing the second island chain defense capability while trying to maintain its advantage in the first island chain by incorporating more military support from its military allies, like Japan, South Korea, or non-official ally, but the Philippines. So the US is calling its partners or allies or friends in the first island chain to join the US effort to contain communist China. But so I'm not saying that the US is giving up the first island chain. No, I don't think that's right. The US is still looking at the first island chain, but by different strategy. In the past, the US basically took the lead. But nowadays, I think the US probably is still taking the lead, but the portion is smaller, and the US is calling for some external help from its allies and partners. So the mainland China, on the other hand, probably is working alone. Its closest allies like Cambodia or Laos, are not capable of helping the Beijing authorities with this kind of first island chain struggle. So mainland China is working alone, I think.
So while strengthening the second island chain, at the same time, what Professor is saying is definitely not going to give up on the first island chain, but at the same time to really maintain the allies that we're looking into here. Especially, seems to be a stronger alliance between the US and Philippines, and also the US and Japan than ever before. So what role can Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines play to protect the first island chain?
Yeah, I think particularly the question is the relations of these different countries. And is there a way, for example, for the US to cement ties between these countries under its auspices? And so the TPP, or trade means of cohering these ties, was one attempt in the past. But then I think particularly the issue is often the specter of Japanese colonialism, where let's say the Philippines or South Korea or Japan, and particularly Japan, are concerned, except perhaps with Taiwan. And so this has proven an issue for Japan and South Korea in the past. But then also under the previous government of the Philippines, under Duterte, we saw a pivot towards China rather. But now under Marcos, we see this kind of shift back towards the US. And so there are kind of these regional fluctuations based on the various politics of these countries. One also saw that in South Korea, for example, with the Moon and the Park administration before that. But then regarding, it's not only the first island chain that matters, also the second island chain. I think particularly the US would try not to put all of its eggs in one basket in that sense. And these different locations can play different roles. Particularly with regards to Taiwan, for example, one of the major matters of concern is basing capacity, which countries would allow the US to use their military bases in the event of an attack on Taiwan.
Professor, do you feel that in terms of a Taiwan contingency, as Brian mentioned, do you feel Ukraine has actually had an impact on bringing US allies together, as you see Korea, South Korea now talking more with Japan?
The countries involved are very different. In Europe, basically it's a NATO member states get involved. But here you are going to see Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, etc. to be involved. So you have to look at these countries' political and economic involvement with the PRC.
Could Thailand flip? Because Thailand seems to be playing both sides.
Thailand, now its cabinet is from the militant junta. So it's rather difficult to imagine that Thailand would switch side if there's a Taiwan contingency.
Though it's home to a lot of U.S. bases, and it was
Right.
the center for Vietnam.
And those U.S. allies or partners, as I mentioned, probably are having very deep or higher level of economic and political engagement with the PRC. So, except Japan, that has the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, I think other U.S. allies might have some difficult time making their own decision, because they need some economic investment from mainland China, while they need some military protection from the U.S.
Right.
So it's so difficult to choose side, and so the situation in Ukraine probably is no comparison with the situation in East Asia.
So we just spoke about Chinese growing ambitions in the Pacific Island chains. Now, coming up next, we will hear from Pacific Islands defense expert Cleo Pascal, Indo-Pacific Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She spoke to RAF about how a potential Chinese blockade of the Pacific Islands will look like in choking off support for Taiwan from U.S. allied forces.
Cleo, how important are the Pacific Islands in terms of supporting Taiwan in the case of a potential invasion from the PLA?
In the case of an invasion of Taiwan, you can see that places like Solomons, for example, where the emplacements are starting to happen, they might look commercial, but then they can suddenly become active, including and especially things like the fishing fleet and the maritime militia that might be floating around in those waters. And so the attack on Taiwan happens, and then cables get cut. Those ports become less commercial and much more strategic in terms of what the ships coming out of them do. And the allies, Australia, for example, can't move. They can't get past Solomons. They can't get past Vanuatu. In terms of the countries, with free association with the U.S., what you'll find in Palau, for example, is that there have been these Chinese shopkeepers that have been there, came from mainland from 10, 20 years ago, and just quietly running shops, normal people. But then the embassy or whoever is representing PRC in the country starts to use them for other things, like brokering real estate deals, getting real estate purchased around strategic U.S. installations. So they start to become activated, and if you have family or businesses back in China, you don't really have a choice. They have leverage over you. They can torture your family. They can take your businesses or whatever. So what looks like a very normal commercial engagement across the region is, I would argue, primed to flip overnight in case of an engagement in Taiwan into barriers all the way across that make it very difficult for the U.S. to especially get reinforcements across.
We just heard from Cleo Pascal on how China could mobilize Pacific Island nations to block U.S. allied support in a potential Taiwan invasion. Brian, how effective is China's current hybrid diplomatic, economic, and military strategies in the South Pacific?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's something that we're all sort of wondering. China often alternates the velvet glove and iron fist approach with any kind of diplomatic situation, alternating incentives and also threats. And so this is the case, I think, particularly with places that are caught between the US and China more generally. In this case, though, I think that there is much more caution now from the island countries that are in the island chains. For example, with a letter written by the outgoing, the Micronesian leader, suggesting even establishing ties with Taiwan and rebalancing towards the US in this sense, rather than leaning on China, citing the fact that when he did travel, for example, he was followed by Chinese agents. This kind of threat doesn't always play well with various national governments.
Professor, how likely do you feel that Taiwan could reestablish ties with Micronesia?
I think the chance has been very small, mainly because the outgoing president has said something that made public the way how he approached Taipei about the money and economic aid in order to, switch diplomatic recognition from PRC to ROC. since he has said that in public, then I think everyone in the world knows that Taipei is talking to Micronesia about the resumption or reestablishment of diplomatic recognition.
Do you draw a comparison, say, with Honduras as well as what we're seeing?
Yeah, actually, I think the two incidents are interrelated. But in terms of Micronesia, my point is that I think the outgoing president has probably killed the idea of establishing ties with Taiwan because he has said something he shouldn't have said. Okay, so that's no more secret.
In terms of the dollar and all that.
Right. And Honduras, I think that's another case. But Honduras, the reason why Honduras made that announcement to trying to set up diplomatic relations with the PRC is mainly because Honduras becomes the target approached by the Beijing authorities. And Honduras was willing to because Honduras would like to get more economic aid because Honduras' its economic situation is poor. So I think, a special envoy, former Senator Todd, was sent by President Biden to Honduras for some negotiations.
Right.
So we don't know what's going on there, but I think with the involvement of the U.S., and with the continued effort of the ROC government in Taipei, I personally hope the diplomatic relations between Honduras and the Republic of China can sustain at least for a few more years.
Right. So in addition to what we're talking about economically, this is a major impact, one of the measures that China is taking right now. We're looking at, Chinese fighter jets have invaded Taiwan like 1,700 times last year, which was quite more than a double of that the year before. So Brian, what do you think this action, what is China trying to imply here?
So it is an attempt to intimidate first and foremost, but it also to influence Taiwanese politics. But I think often what it gets discarded in the focus on the fighter jets is the military signaling that takes place about China's capacities. Although it seems like a very repetitive news story sometimes, just China deploys more fighters, they're often in different regions. And so I think this is a form of military signaling to the US, to Taiwan, to everyone really.
Has it worked?
It's a question. I think people in Taiwan are often very kind of inured to it. People are quite used to it at this point. It's become a daily news occurrence, and it just kind of sinks into the news cycle. It hasn't really created a narrative, or there's no eventfulness about it at this point.
Professor, speaking of PLA military activity, it expanded to include training, joint land, sea, and rockets in the Bashi Channel.
Right.
How much of this is an attempt to choke off Taiwan?
The most stupid way for the PLA to conquer Taiwan is to use bombs, missiles, to ruin every inch of piece of land in Taiwan.
But is this a sign for the U.S.? Is it trying to threaten the U.S. by doing these military drills in the south of Taiwan?
You mean the Bashi Channel thing? Yes. So, I think that has been a very strategically important place for both mainland China and the U.S. And as I implied, a smarter way for the PLA is to block Taiwan, and probably not block around Taiwan, but block some important ports of Taiwan. For instance, what if there is going to be a blockade by the PLA around the Taichung Harbor, where there's a lot of LNG recipient equipments for Taiwan, and Taiwan has relied heavily on this LNG for its energy, electricity, etc., etc. So if there's a longer blockade imposed by the PLA on the Taichung Harbor, what are we going to do? So this blockade strategy, including these important shipping routes through the Bashi Channel or the Taiwan Strait, etc., will be very important military targets for the PLA to maneuver its blockade strategy. So for the U.S. government, of course, the U.S. would like to show some muscles to deter any possible PLA blockade around Taiwan. Meanwhile, the U.S. is selling more advanced weapons to Taiwan trying to enhance Taiwan's anti-blockade strategy.
Professor, is this also why you see 4 new bases in the Philippines that the U.S. will be using? Is it to deter China?
The 4 bases, I would say they are of multiple purposes. Like, of course, the 4 bases are for the U.S. Philippines military cooperation aimed at the South China Sea. That's the most important. And secondly, that is for the better training of the Philippine troops. And third, of course, these bases can serve as an important logistics support for the U.S. if there's a Taiwan contingency. So I think there are multiple purposes, but of course, these will cause some concern from the Beijing authorities.
Brian, how serious do you feel Beijing is on this? As we've seen when the Nancy Pelosi visit, they blockaded Taiwan for about a week. Do you feel that they have got enough training to do this?
Well, it's a question. I think that would be an act of war. A blockade would literally be an act of war. And I think it would not be then out of the question for Taiwan to respond militarily. And I think that often then blockade scenarios, and as they're discussed internationally, seem to assume Taiwan would only be passive with regards to that kind of event. But then regarding a blockade, I think perhaps the more training China has, the more effective that could potentially be. But then China is also signaling its capacities. I also do think, though, that it is perhaps a good thing. There's much more discussion of blockade scenarios currently. In the past, it was thought of in terms of invasion, just invasion, all or nothing in terms of a Taiwan contingency. And so seeing these intermediate scenarios or gray zone warfare and now talk of a blockade, that is important. But then it is a question how effective a blockade would be. At the same time, there are also calls from naval experts, for example, that Taiwan should focus not on denying China access to the sea, perhaps, in the territories, but more kind of control of them. And so there is this sense of China's growing naval capacities.
What do you feel the U.S. is at in terms of this blockade? Is the U.S. preparing, as Professor said, in terms of helping Taiwan to deal with a potential blockade?
So usually there is a military signaling from the U.S. And one did see, for example, joint drills conducted by some of these various nations we've described after the live fire exercise in August. The question then is how far would it go in a blockade scenario? Because when you do have a blockade occurring, and perhaps if there is intervention, or perhaps, let's say, an escort of a ship going through the blockade, that does push you to the brink of war, perhaps, between 2 major powers. I mean, there were similar scenarios, let's say, during the Cold War regarding the blockade of Cuba, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so there are some precedents for this, but it is quite dangerous, perhaps.
We just spoke China's military intimidation and coalition campaigns against Taiwan and its ambitions in taking over the island nation. Now, coming up next, Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, speaks to RAF about the U.S. commitment to the defense of Taiwan and how it is boosting ties with Pacific Island nations to counter Chinese expansionism.
Patrick, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, mentioned on 60 Minutes that if the U.S. president and Congress authorize the Navy to deploy its troops, it will come en masse to support Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. How realistic is it?
I would take Admiral Aquilino at his word. He would have an obligation, obviously, if he's asked by the president, the commander-in-chief, and backed by Congress to do so. But I think he would be leaning forward in any scenario in which, if Taiwan were attacked, he would be trying to bring not just the Navy, but all of the joint force that he commands in the Pacific to bear to try to stop an attack against Taiwan and to prosecute toward a peace.
How is China trying to interrupt such efforts?
China has been running around the globe and the region, including in the South Pacific, trying to both block U.S. and U.S. allies out and to try to promote Chinese interests in. We saw this obviously last year with the signing of a security pact with the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands is instructive because only 4 years ago it was aligned with Taiwan. And in that 4 years, not only has Prime Minister Sogavare, in his 4th stint as Prime Minister, suddenly found new life, he has really invigorated the Solomon Island-China relationship. And that's been of great concern, such concern that the coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell, talking in New Zealand this month about U.S. is concerned about any military support that the Solomon Islands might provide for Chinese military forces. For instance, there's a deep port outside of Aniara, the capital, that the Chinese supposedly have access to. They're also putting in Huawei telecommunications. So the idea that this becomes not just a logistics hub, but under a security pact about which the terms are still secret, China could have untold access and really turn the Solomons into a key staging area for emphasis and influence outside.
How concerning is this?
The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, would love to cut a broad swath right down this so-called PLA corridor from China all the way down toward Australia and pose a threat down to U.S. facilities and basing and staging areas that may be constructed in the coming years in Australia, but also against Australian forces. And that's why they would like to try to get through past Guam, past the Marianas and the Micronesia sort of confederations and into the middle of the Pacific all the way down to Australia. That would give them an ability to break up allied supply chains, supply lines rather, and reinforcements of any scenario, including against in defense of Taiwan.
As China continues to try to block and impede the first island chain down to the third island chain?
Well, China is, in the first instance, pursuing a diplomatic strategy, right? They're trying to strangle off Taiwan's diplomatic partners, 1/3 of whom are still in the Pacific. They were able to turn and flip Kiribati and the Solomon Islands in the last 4 years. And they may well be using this access and influence for exactly this purpose. In fact, the outgoing president of Micronesia said this is what the Chinese were doing. They were handing out envelopes of cash. They were using coercion. They were even threatening bodily harm to him, he said in a 13-page letter earlier this month. So I think the military part of the strategy that you're alluding to is very serious, but it's longer term. It's part of this growing PLA capability that they're on sort of tap to try by 2027 to have a sufficient capability that they could pose a credible invasion scenario against the island of Taiwan. And meanwhile, being able to interdict supply lines of communication from the U.S., from Australia, from other U.S. allies and partners in the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, it would be part of this comprehensive strategy that the PLA would be putting together. Essentially, they're trying to slow down, militarily speaking, in any contingency on Taiwan, in which they're trying to forcibly unify Taiwan in recent years. And that's what's most concerning in driving U.S. allies and partners together, including people like Kurt Campbell, who's been in New Zealand and the South Pacific recently, to try to, again, increase the influence and partnership with Pacific Island nations, not just in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, not just in Northeast Asia, not just with India and in the Indian Ocean, but really across this entire region, so that the United States and allies and partners have options, have resilience, have capacity that they will be able to use in a distributed form to reassure partners like Taiwan that they will not be abandoned in a crisis.
How successful are these efforts? Do you feel Kurt Campbell and U.S. officials can effectively stop China from these efforts in stopping support from the U.S.?
Yes, they can. They can certainly do so in the short to medium term. What we don't know is the medium to long term. And since we can't imagine the longer term future, let's stick to the short to medium term. And right now, these efforts are exactly the kind of assertiveness and urgency that are needed to reassure allies and partners, but also to improve our chances of having a credible capability to defend the peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, including in a Taiwan contingency.
Let's talk about Allied support. Patrick just mentioned that the U.S. Pacific Fleet would come in full force in the event of a Taiwan invasion. Professor, we heard Patrick talk about the U.S. Pacific Fleet coming in full force. Is this something that Taiwan should be assured, or do you feel Taiwan needs to do more to protect itself?
I can answer your question in another way. Can we imagine what is going to happen if the U.S. is going to give its full military involvement in the Taiwan Strait? Then what's going to happen next? How about the island of Taiwan? How about people like us living in Taiwan? So of course we don't like to see that happening. But I think that would be the worst scenario, not only for the PRC, but also for the USA.
It would be two superpowers
Two
fighting each
superpower fighting, and
Could
Taiwan
go
will
nuclear war, perhaps?
maybe, because the logic in war is very different from our logic in our daily life. But I am not quite sure whether or not Mr. Patrick Cronin is correct in saying that the U.S. is going to come in full force in the Taiwan contingency.
I think he was quoting one of the admirals of the Pacific Fleet who said that
Right. But
authorized,
I'd
they
rather
would
believe that there is another comment made by the U.S. naval commanders in the PACOM, just probably in March, that the fleet has been ready to give full support for Taiwan if the fleet receive the order from the top. So of course the military should be ready. The military should be ready, but I think it's more important to see how we can get rid of these potential military confrontations between the two giant armed forces.
I think if we kind of move back to a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit more about to what extent is the U.S. going to help Taiwan? Or let's just put it this way: to what extent is Taiwan going to support Taiwan if things, if there's an invasion really happening? And at the same time, we also have to look into, again, we have this board, and this will further let us know more about the first, second, and third island chain. So could Professor also give us a little bit kind of idea? In case if there's like an invasion or anything, how would these three island chains work, and what will their roles be? And at this point of time for Taiwan, how can we work with our neighboring countries, let's say for example South Korea or Japan, on the first island chain to resist such attack from China?
I think it's very possible that if there's an armed conflict taking place in the West Pacific, it should be within the second island chain.
As we are
That
seeing
is-
over here.
Yeah, as you
Guam
can see,
onwards.
probably Guam would be the very critical spot. Because the third island chain, all the way to Hawaii, I think if the PLA's force can reach that part, I think that means there must have been some problem with the U.S.
Right,
armed force.
exactly.
Okay, so first island chain, second island chain could be the most potential battle theaters between U.S. and mainland China. And here you can see Taiwan has been in a very important position because Taiwan is roughly in the middle of the first island chain. And Taiwan has a very good location to monitor a lot of military activities
Right.
of the
Professor,
PLA.
do you feel there's more that we need to do here in Taiwan? Is there anything the government you think needs to do more on?
Of course, enhancing self-defense capability is always one of the top priorities.
Right.
But the second is, as I said, probably in this program too, before, that we need to find some political consultations with the potential enemies, so that there should be fewer and fewer miscalculations and misunderstanding between
And to
Taipei
learn
and
more about
Beijing.
them, to know
Right,
who they are.
Right, and also, I think the intelligence exchange cooperation among U.S. allies and friends is also very important. So not only Japan, South Korea, but Taiwan, I think, in a way, has been able to join this kind of intelligence exchange, so that this allies friend coalition, not coalition, ally friends cooperation. Will serve as important foundation for U.S. defense capability and willingness for this area.
And then especially the U.S. and Philippines, they will be having their military drills in mid-April, Brian. So at the same time, as we're seeing China, Russia, and Iran, they're having a lot of dialogues going on lately as well. So do you believe that these two superpowers, a collision might happen anytime soon, probably still less than a few years? Do you think it's inevitable?
Well, I think it's a question. I mean, there's always this talk of, let's say, the Thucydides trap and so forth, the possibility or inevitability of conflict between a rising power and the dominant power. At the same time, then, I do think we're actually quite far from the projections that some do have of imminent warfare, of nuclear warfare, and so forth. I think both parties have seen the lessons of the Cold War and will not want to dial up tensions immediately.
But there is going to be impact economically, for
Of course. And so I think that is actually one of the major deterrents that is often left out of military analysis, in the sense that China's economy and Taiwan's economy are deeply interlinked. And the fact is, any economy going to crisis would cause a global cataclysm. It takes place at a time in which China's economy is already slowing, and there was a massive death toll because of COVID. And so could they actually handle all this on their plate? I think that is a question. But then I think also you do see this increased anxiety among countries in the Indo-Pacific regarding China, and that's why you do see this military drilling, which is also signaling. Push comes to shove, it would be another question entirely. Would there be action from these countries in a concerted manner regarding Taiwan or any other action by China? But I think that particularly, this is maybe one way in which the drilling by China actually prompts other countries in the region to more seriously reflect on these questions. And so it does create the sense of urgency to arrive at consensus on this.
Brian, how effective do you feel that China could block U.S. support or allied support, say Australia, with their new subs to come to support Taiwan if this event ever happens?
It's quite interesting because we do have AUKUS, for example, the submarine technology sharing agreement between the US, UK, and Australia as of late. And so this is something that China finds very provocative. But particularly Australia, the debate about China has become very intense. There's a lot of concern about China. Oftentimes the debate in Australia is as though China would attack Australia and not Taiwan first. So I think there is much concern in Australia regarding this. And I think this is perhaps one way in which China perhaps could have relied more on soft power rather than military threats that often have the opposite of the intended effect.
Professor, the Pentagon's top Indo-Pacific person, Eli Ratner, mentioned that in Congress that he's confident that the U.S. could effectively deter China, the PRC, from an invasion of Taiwan in this decade.
Right.
How credible do you feel this statement is?
In terms of deterrence, usually we have at least two basic forms. One is deterrence by capability, another deterrence by denial. In the Taiwan Strait, I doubt there is a great possibility that the U.S. can carry out this kind of deterrence by denial, because there's no Great Wall in the median line of the Taiwan Strait. So basically, you cannot deny the potential attacks from the PRC by setting up some concrete stuff. But deterrence by capability is, I think, the most important program the U.S. has been working on in order to keep Taiwan safer. But capabilities, not only the U.S. own, but also Taiwan's own. So the U.S. capability to deter depends on Washington and depends on Taipei. And I now see a very smooth communication channel between Washington and Taipei in terms of arms acquisition for the self-defense of Taiwan. But I think one of the key questions is whether or not Taiwan can get appropriate weaponry systems and how soon.
Right.
Like the case of Ukraine, right? Ukraine has been calling for some advanced weapons from the West, but the West provision to Ukraine is not fast enough. So I think that would be an important question to ponder. And also, in terms of deterrence by capabilities, the participation of coalition force in the West Pacific became very obviously important.
That means Japan, Philippines.
The Philippines can provide bases, but the military force of the Philippines is not strong enough to serve as an important pillar for the U.S. Deterrence strategy in the West Pacific. So now probably people are looking at South Korea. South Korea is changing its attitude towards Japan, in a good way. And South Koreans is leaning more towards the United States under the Moon administration. So whether or not South Korea will be joining greatly the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance and help U.S. maintain stability and peace in Northeast Asia or in East Asia in general, I think we'll wait and see.
So in addition to a stronger alliance, what do you think, among Japan, South Korea, and also in the US? As for people here in Taiwan, what do you think is the best self-defense strategy?
The best self-defense strategy for Taiwan. I think there is what I call the SEED strategy, or SEED.
Seed strategy.
SEED. SEED strategy, S stands for Solidarity in Taiwan Society. That is, we need to form a more united national identity. You want to call it Republic of China or Taiwan? We can have a debate in society, or we can call both. ROC is Taiwan, Taiwan is ROC. We need a stronger solidarity in our society so that we can have a better unity to meet the possible confrontation from Beijing. And the first C, SEED, so the first E stands for economic robustness. I don't want to spend too much money on that because everyone knows that this economic robustness is so important for Taiwan since day one. And the second E refers to energy autonomy.
Okay.
So if Taiwan loses its energy autonomy, or Taiwan has to be reliant heavily on energy imports, but then Taiwan will be very fragile when the PRC try to blockade Taiwan.
Right.
And last word, D, stands for defense, of course. But defense, there are twofold. One fold is, of course, military defense. But the second fold is psychological defense.
Right.
So we need to be very cautious of the United Front strategy conducted by the PLA.
We just talked about China's all-out attempts at blocking potential US allied support in the event of a Taiwan invasion. Let us know in the comment section how successful China could be at this. Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
Thank you all for watching our show today. Please stay safe and see you all next time.